Welcome to Future Knowledge, a podcast about knowledge, creativity, and policy, brought to you by the Internet Archive and Authors Alliance. The Grateful Dead's legacy isn't just about their music. It's about how that music was experienced, captured, and shared. From official releases to fan-made tapes, the band's live recordings have played a pivotal role in shaping their cultural impact. But why have these live recordings become so central to the band's mythology? What do they reveal about ourselves and the value we place on the live experience? Hi, everyone. I'm Chris Freeland, a librarian at the Internet Archive. I want to welcome you to today's book talk. Today, we're exploring Live Dead, the Grateful Dead, live recordings, and the ideology of liveness by John Brackett. Leading our conversation today will be musician and Grateful Dead historian David Gans. Kicking off our discussion today is Dave Hansen, the Executive Director of Authors Alliance. Over to you, Dave.
Thanks, Chris. So welcome, everybody. I'm really glad to be here today and to co-host this talk about Live Dead, published by Duke University Press. So today, I'm pleased to introduce David Gans as moderator. Many of you probably recognize David. He's a musician, including having performed on stage with members of the Grateful Dead. He's also a music journalist. He's the host of the Grateful Dead Hour, which I would encourage you to check out, and co-author of the book Playing in the Band, an oral and visual portrait of the Grateful Dead. In introducing our talk with John Brackett, author of Live Dead. John is a musicologist, independent scholar, and author of a couple other books, including one that I've encountered students use quite a bit, the Routledge Companion to Popular Music Analysis, Expanding Approaches. So I'm going to turn it over to David, and we're going to get going on this talk.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having us here at the Internet Archive. I'm just going to start by reading the prompt that John gave me. We will interact a little bit more than that, but I want to set him up as he chose to be set up. For almost 60 years, fans, critics, and writers have recognized the Grateful Dead as one of the preeminent live groups of the rock era. From the mid-1960s until the death of Jerry Garcia in 1995, the Grateful Dead maintained a tireless touring schedule and were routinely among the top-grossing concert artists of the time. Moreover, the group's regular and predictable touring schedule helped to foster a multi-generational community of fans, the Deadheads, and a distinctive countercultural tradition that still resonates among contemporary audiences. Even the title of your book, John, Live Dead, seems to acknowledge the live legacy of the Grateful Dead, yet the book is all about recordings. Given the long-standing and enduring myth of the Dead as a live band, why are you focusing on the recordings?
First of all, thanks so much, David, for speaking with me today. Thanks to everyone at the Internet Archive and the Authors Alliance. This is a tremendous honor, and I'm really happy to speak a little bit about Live Dead today. One of the most valuable resources when I'm doing research on the Dead is the massive trove of live concert recordings that are freely accessible via the Live Music Archive as part of the Internet Archive. In Live Dead and another book that I have coming out on the Dead in the spring, I refer to numerous recorded concert performances that are hosted by the LMA. I'm sure many people tuning in today are probably familiar with the Dead's strong presence on the LMA. But for those of you who are not, I would encourage you to poke around a little bit and see what you can find on the LMA's massive recorded collection. But you're exactly right, to return to your point, David. The popular legacy of the Dead is built upon their reputation as a constantly evolving creative ensemble of improvising musicians and the distinctive community and culture that developed around their shows. But along with their live legacy, they're also one of the most popular recording acts of all time. Last year, the Dead broke the record for the most albums to appear on the top 40 of the Billboard 200, their top album chart. The previous record had been shared by Frank Sinatra and Elvis. They both had 58. The Dead's record-breaking 59th top 40 release was the latest volume in Dave's Picks, their series of live archival releases that was inaugurated in 2012. This was volume 49, 2 shows from Stanford in April of 1985.
Isn't that ironic as hell, given that the Grateful Dead did not really sell a lot of records in their lifetime?
And this is important because, yeah, of those 59 top 40 releases, 46 of those had been released in the years following Jerry Garcia's death. And 41 of those to chart in the top 40 were individual volumes of the Dave's Pick series. So there's no doubting that the Dead's overwhelming popularity in the years following Garcia's death has been influenced by live recordings. But at the same time, live recordings figure prominently throughout the Dead's long career. And in Live Dead, I examine the historical role played by live recordings in both establishing and promoting the myth of the Dead as a live band. But even before they had released their first record, they were being heralded throughout the Bay Area as the top performing group associated with the local music scene. And by early 1967, that reputation had begun to spread to the East Coast. What you see here is a column that appeared in the Village Voice in March of 1967, a piece by Richard Goldstein called The Flourishing Underground. And in many ways, this was the rock fans on the East Coast, their introduction to the emerging San Francisco scene. In his column, Goldstein describes venues associated with the scene, the Fillmore, but really focuses his attention on four bands: Quicksilver Messenger Service, Big Brother and the Holding Company, Jefferson Airplane, and of course, The Dead. And one of the things that he emphasizes throughout the column is that really what makes San Francisco so unique and the music there so distinctive is that these bands were accustomed to playing for dancers, and therefore they had to learn how to accommodate the ebbs and flows of a dance. These were musicians who were especially adept at improvising. And in his column, he quotes Ralph Gleason, the renowned San Francisco-based rock and jazz critic, who said that the important thing about San Francisco rock and roll is that the bands here all sing and play live and not for recordings. You get a different sound at a dance. It's harder and more direct. And in Goldstein's opinion, no band better represented the live aspect of the San Francisco scene than the Dead. When he introduced them in his column, he did so with the memorable phrase that the Grateful Dead sound like live thunder. He was so taken by the sound of the band's live shows that he pointed out that as of that point, there were no recordings of their music, which is probably just as well, he noted, because no album could produce the feeling that they generate in a dance hall. So in Goldstein's estimation, what makes the Dead's concert so unique was that special feeling that they generated among the audience. A feeling, he says, that couldn't be replicated or reproduced on recordings. But then he makes a rather curious admission. He actually admits that he has actually never seen them perform live, and that his idea of the band sounding like live thunder came about by spending an evening listening to tapes at the Fillmore. Yeah, so having just compared the Dead performances to live thunder, not only does he acknowledge not seeing them, but despite his skepticism that recordings are able to capture that energy, he describes the experience of the Dead shows by what he experienced not in a concert, but by listening to tapes. So it would seem that for about 60 years, live recordings have played a really important role in helping to kind of propagate and sustain that idea of the band as an essentially live group. And by early 1967, audiences on both coasts were growing increasingly familiar with the idea of the Grateful Dead as a live band. However, they had just signed a record contract, and now they were going to be expected to produce records. So now the band, their management, and their label, Warner Brothers, as they're prepared to kind of record their first record, are probably a bit anxious about how the Dead are going to kind of capture that live reputation and hopefully capture it on record. And their debut record came out in March of 1967. The majority of the tunes were recorded in Los Angeles on 4-track. One tune was recorded in San Francisco. That was the Golden Road. Other than the Golden Road, all of the songs that appear on the Dead's debut album would have been familiar to their concert audiences at the time. These were all songs that had been road tested. And moreover, these were songs that, when performed live, were often vehicles for extended improvisations. So therefore, the band elected to, when they went to the studio to record, in an effort to kind of capture that live energy and maybe some of the spontaneity and creativity from their concerts, the group and their producer elected to record the backing tracks live in the studio, and Ned would overdub vocal parts and instrumental solos at a later date. A couple of weeks after the record came out, Jerry Garcia and Phil Lesh appeared on Tom Donahue's radio program on KMPX, where they acted as guest DJs. And at one point, Donahue asked if listeners could expect to hear anything from the band's latest record. And as you're going to hear, they didn't seem particularly pleased with that. Not pleased with that idea, but they didn't seem very enthusiastic about it.
And the album's done unbelievably well outside of town. I haven't checked your list completely, man. Are you going to place anything from it?
No,
we don't get a chance to tear it apart or anything like that and say, man,
we can talk about it.
Sure. Why did you blow that note there? How do you feel about the album yourselves, personally?
I feel like it's a turd.
Yeah, not where you wanted to be.
Well, no, it was where we were at the time.
Yeah, right. Yeah. It's something we did. It's all over with, and it's...
The next one certainly won't be anything like that one.
No.
Yeah. That one anyway.
Yeah.
The way we've sort of... it's like that one is sort of an attempt to try and sound like the way the stuff that we do live with the same instrumentation and everything. There's not really anything unconventional for us in there.
But that's impossible to do in a recording studio.
Right. So we're not going to try and bother. We're not going to bother doing that anymore. We're just going to, like, from now on, when we go and record, since the first album is doing so nicely, we hope to let us have a lot of time in the studio, and next time we'll do a lot more studio.
So Garcia acknowledges the band's efforts to capture that live energy on the first record, but then also acknowledges that he felt it was entirely unsuccessful. Donahue then responds and points out that in many respects, it has to do with the limitations of contemporary recording technology.
The whole problem of trying to take what live sounds like and put it on some kind of tape or disc or something.
Yeah, but you can't do it in a studio. You might be able to do it if you could record a rock and roll band live, at the volumes that we play at live, like at the Fillmore or something like that. And maybe after about 2 or 3 months of every night at the Fillmore, we'd start to get, good cuts, good enough for an album, in terms of how clean they were and how much we'd like the performance on them. And then we'd have something, but it'd be such an expensive undertaking and long and everything. And the studio facilities are so incredible that we should do something with them. So we're going to go in there, and try, something different.
Approaching it from a different angle altogether.
Right.
I have to say, John, it's a perfectly valid document of what they sounded like at that moment. And Jerry had a lifelong habit of downplaying his own stuff, of disavowing their stuff. And every musician the bumper sticker, great art is never completed, only abandoned. That is so true of the Grateful Dead's history, but their records have always been better than Jerry ever gave them credit for.
Agreed. But it's also true, as Phil said too, that they're really, documents of their time. And so they are snapshots,
but that's what they sounded like, and it's not a bad document of that moment. And by the way, I just have to say in passing, Phil once referred to the first album as, quote, that Ritalin and hashish sound, unquote.
Yes, I believe it. But yeah, at the end there, Garcia's describing how, going into the studio, next time they were going to do something completely different. And for those of you who are familiar with the band's discography, this is exactly what they did. With Anthem of the Sun, they really created one of the defining records of kind of psychedelic rock era. Took over a year to record and produce, various studios in LA, San Francisco, and New York. Many things to talk about with this record. One of the most interesting is how the band and their producers worked to combine studio recordings and live recordings. What you see here is a document that the band referred to when they were producing side 2 of the record. And for those of you who don't know, that side 2, there are 2 songs, Alligator and Caution, Do Not Stop on the Tracks. The songs segue one into the other. There's no break. Both songs feature Ron McKiernan, Pigpen, on lead vocals, one of the founding members. And both songs also are made up of multiple distinct sections. And many of those sections were reserved for forms of improvisation when performed live. Looking at the left-hand side of this document, you see a series of numbers running down there, 1 through 6. Numbers 1 through 3 refer to the distinct sections of Alligator, and sections 4 through 6 refer to those of Caution. I want to focus a little bit of attention on the structure and design of Alligator, because this really is a great document of trying to figure out how the band are also still thinking about this live aspect of their reputation. If you look at the top left corner next to the encircle number 1, you'll see a timing, 000. That's the start of side 2, the beginning of Alligator. And right below that, you'll see an indication, the word studio. For the first 3 minutes and 15 seconds, the material that you hear in Alligator had been recorded in the studio. Now, probably very different studios at different places, different times that were then edited together. This is all studio material at the opening. If you look beneath the studio indication there, you can also see a series of numbers running horizontally across the page, 1 through 8. And these refer to the individual channels of the 8-track mixing board. Whereas the previous album had been recorded on 4-track, now they had access to 8 tracks. And you can see the individual instruments that are included on some of the tracks. Under number 1, you can see the word lead for lead vocals. Skipping over to track 3, the bass. Track 5, the piano. But you'll also notice some of the tracks include multiple performances. Track 4, the conga, the organ and the rhythm guitar, and then over on at the end, track 8, the kazoo and the backup vocals. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to play the opening, and you can hear this opening studio material, but then I'm going to fade it out just around at the time the kazoos enter, and I'm going to fade it up. And when I fade it up, it's going to be at the point that's indicated by the number 2 on that page. Because at that point, the band have inserted an edit. And in particular, it's a section of Alligator that they had performed live in February of '68 at the Carousel Ballroom. So after the fade out and it fades in, you're going to hear a distinct change in the timbre of the recording, and you're also going to hear a much quicker tempo. Now fade it back in. Right there. Hear the change in the quality of the tape. Much quicker. You're tapping your foot.
Come on, everybody. Get up and dance. We won't ruin you.
For about the next 6.5 minutes, the listener hears now this live recording from the Carousel Ballroom. I'm going to fade out the recording again. And when I fade it back in, it's going to be around the area marked with number 3. This is another different live recording. This is from the Shrine Auditorium in Los Angeles from November 1967. Right there, you can hear the change in the quality of the tape.
I'm frankly surprised that that happened that way.
I was especially impressed with the tempo syncing up from the end of 2 to number 3. That was pretty good.
Yeah, but it's still there's a pretty harsh sonic change at the butt splice, which I'm a little bit surprised. I guess they couldn't find a better way to get that done, but it's
in 1968, I think this.
Well, this was various people told me about this, and they did the mix of this. But they sort of performed stuff onto the 8-track live with like Healy or whoever was like orchestrating people starting various tape decks and stuff. I mean, they did a lot. I think this is on a par with the Beatles for how they managed to cram such a huge amount of information into such a small number of tracks.
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, I said it, one of the defining documents of the psychedelic rock era. I mean, it is up there with Sgt. Pepper's in terms of its sound, the songs, but also the production as well. It's interesting, though, but because they're still thinking about this kind of latest approach representing how they are going to incorporate these live elements. And now it's this kind of hybrid, syncretic approach of combining studio recordings with live recordings. But really, it was while recording the follow-up album, Oxamoxoa, that the band was introduced to the latest major technological advance, and that was the 16-track recorder, first manufactured by Ampex. So in the studio, 16 channels offered numerous opportunities for the band to experiment while they were making their new record. At the same time, 16 tracks offered a number of opportunities when recording live, especially for a band that at this point had 7 members. Whereas recording to 8-track often entailed that the band record multiple musical performances on a single track, the 16-track machine allowed the band's engineers and producers to record and isolate individual vocal and instrumental parts on separate channels. And obviously, this would provide greater clarity in the recording, but it also enabled greater flexibility when mixing and editing during post-production. And in many respects, it was the introduction of the 16-track that really ushered in the modern era of rock recording, live rock recording. And some of the band's earliest live recordings produced on the 16-track were featured on Live Dead, their first live album from '69. While the band's previous studio albums had generally been well received, Live Dead was immediately embraced by fans and critics who felt like it really was the first record to kind of capture the band's liveness. And the recording fidelity offered by the 16-track recorder is obvious right at the very opening with Dark Star. The recording, it begins incredibly quiet. You can hear the snares buzz on the snare drum. You can hear the hum of the amplifier. All of the voices remarkably clear, from Phil Lesh's the low register of the bass to the upper register of the cymbals. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to stop it there. Just wonder we probably could continue on because I've been focusing really on what has been happening with the band themselves. But as most people are familiar with, there's this whole different tradition that developed with regards to live recordings, and those that were produced by the fans. And in many ways, the fans they presented their own kind of recording aesthetic at the time. And to kind of really go back to the roots of taping and the audience recordings, it's important to kind of remember when that began. By the late 60s and early 70s, just as Live Dead had been released, people throughout the recording industry were really becoming aware of this emerging market for bootleg records. And like I said, a few months before Live Dead had been released, a compilation of performances by Bob Dylan was beginning to become available in record stores throughout the United States. It was often shipped in a plain white sleeve and sometimes stamped with the title of Great White Wonder. But this was a double record of various recordings, early performances, outtakes, especially those that featured the band as part of the basement tape sessions, along with radio and television appearances. To be sure, this was an album, this was not released by Columbia, Dylan's label. This was compiled and produced and distributed by an upstart group of people who called themselves the Trademark of Quality. In many respects, The Great White Wonder was the first major bootleg of the rock era, and it really helped to usher in this new market for unreleased and unofficial recordings. The practice of bootlegging and bootlegs themselves had become so prominent that in February of 70, Rolling Stone had a cover story on the topic. And in that same issue, critic Grail Marcus actually reviewed 4 contemporary bootleg LPs, 2 by Dylan, 1 by John Lennon and the Plastic Ono Band, and then a 4th one, and let's see, you can see it here, but this was also distributed on in a simple plain white sleeve, and it was produced by Lurch Records, and it was called Liver Than You'll Ever Be, and it was attributed to the greatest group on earth. The reality, this is the Rolling Stones, and this is a recording of live performance from the Oakland Coliseum in November of 1969. And it was produced by a fan who smuggled in the tape-to-tape recording machine and recorded the performance on a handheld microphone. Because with this obvious rise in the practice of taping, the Dead were understandably kind of wary of having their concerts being bootlegged. And around this time, you start to find instances of members of the band's road crew busting people attempting to record the performances. In this excerpt, you're going to hear road manager Sam Cutler confronting an audience member during a show at Temple University in May of 1970. And in many respects, Cutler is one of the most important figures in the development of the Grateful Dead as a business. Prior to his work as the road manager for the Dead, he held the same position for the Rolling Stones. In fact, he was the Stones' road manager during the band's 69 tour of the U.S., including the show at the Oakland Coliseum that was bootlegged. He was familiar with Liver Than You'll Ever Be and the excellent sound quality of that record, and he seemed especially intent on limiting the number of bootlegs that were going to be made of the Dead. And starts up again. Cutting in and out.
Can't hear you, John. Again, John.
Turn it off.
And sometimes the band would call out suspected bootleggers from the stage. This is from a show on New Year's Eve, December 31st of 1970.
There's some bootleggers
spotlights
among
on
you
the
back
microphones
here.
out there.
Let's find out who these people are. Follow the cords
Right.
from those microphones, folks.
Yeah, right.
And you'll find
There's
the
one
mysterious...
sticking up, dead
Put
center.
that spotlight out there on that microphone, the periscope. You'll see it sticking up there. Who is that? Ah, it's going down. Boy, they're not very cooperative right here. Yeah. I wonder who that is. Hiya.
Underground Records Incorporated.
Yeah. Find this one for $10 at your next local record.
As long as you keep the price down, you ought to put it in a paper bag, you know, a plain brown paper bag.
So,
Great excerpts from 70 and 71 of that.
before you go on, John, I want to mention that there were recording hobbyists around before, it became a Grateful Dead obsession. There was a guy named Harry Ely here in the Bay Area who brought his open reel deck to lots of different concerts and stuff. It didn't become such a fraught thing until Great White Wonder, I think, when bootleg vinyl started to happen. Suddenly everybody got really upset about it, but the Grateful Dead developed a different attitude, right?
Yeah, of course. What time was he recording? So this was before Great White Wonder. I mean, how prevalent was recording before that album? Really?
There were audiophiles. They weren't, it wasn't just deadheads. People were audiophiles. They wanted to bring their recorders. And I mean, Harry recorded a lot of different things in a lot of different places, including the Fillmore and all. There were other people with tape decks in the Fillmore as well. It just didn't become a controversial matter until suddenly somebody started commercializing the illicit recordings.
Right. Exactly. And really, for the next couple of years, the practice of taping at the Dead shows, it's continued to grow. Cutler and other members tried to rein it in, but for the most part, they just learned to kind of tolerate it to a certain extent. And meanwhile, the band continued to release live records that were incredibly successful. Alongside this parallel movement of audience recordings that were going on, the Dead are releasing a double record, Skull and Roses, The Grateful Dead, and then the following year, triple record of Europe 72. Both of these were certified gold. Again, a testament really to the appeal of live recordings among fans for the Dead. But by 1972, the Dead were becoming aware that, yes, something was different with the tapers. It wasn't just all bootleggers. They started to receive a great deal of correspondence from people throughout the country who were part of various tape exchanges. And what you see here, this is a document that is housed in the Grateful Dead archive in UC Santa Cruz. And along with the recordings, a great deal of my research is really based on the remarkable documents and materials that are housed at the Grateful Dead archive there. In fact, just not to be too risque, but I am wearing my Grateful Slug shirt from UCSC today in honor of that and in honor of all archivists and librarians everywhere. You do God's work. But this memo that you see here was from business manager David Parker to band manager John McIntyre. And he's describing a group called the Free Underground Grateful Dead Tape Exchange. In particular, he's concerned because some people are starting to inquire about possible sales arrangements. These groups working with the Dead in producing and distributing live concert recordings. Parker is a little bit concerned about this. Again, still wary because of the kind of the bootleg industry. And he writes to McIntyre that I believe we need to work out a policy on this sort of thing. Get the band's opinions. Should we stomp out the practice, license, tacitly tolerate them, or what? Now, for the past few years, the band had been semi-regularly recording and storing recordings of their live shows. And so he noted that at this point, we've got a lot of those live tapes. If live tapes are that popular, he suggested, should we look at this as an alternative revenue method? Now, among many of the letters that the band received, they received many from someone named Leslie Capel. For those of you who are familiar with the massive universe of people who populate the Grateful Dead land, Leslie Capel is known as, or is recognized as one of the founding publishers of Dead Relics, the oldest ancestor of Relics, the magazine journal devoted to live music making, Americana, jam bands. But in its original form, well, semi-original form, Dead Relics, this was a magazine, a fanzine dedicated to taping and trading live concert recordings. In the back would be classified images, classified ads with contact information for tapers who wanted to connect up with other people. There were also informational articles about gear, recording gear, where to set up at certain venues to get the best sound, and also how to avoid getting busted by venue security and members of the Dead's road crew. But before becoming a very popular fanzine, Dead Relics was imagined as something else. In March of '74, before the first issue appeared, Capel sent a business proposal to the Dead called Dead Relics, not with an X, but here CS. And at this point, he conceived Dead Relics as the name of a company whose purpose it would be to obtain and distribute soundboard copies of concert tapes through what he called the Connoisseurs Club. This would be a club of people who had signed up to receive the recordings of the band's current shows. Capel imagined that he and the Dead could work together in producing these recordings. The first method of possibly working together, he suggested, would be for the Dead to release and send a copy of the master recording to Dead Relics, his apartment in Brooklyn, and that Dead Relics, in turn, would reproduce the concert in cassette and 8-track form.
8-track.
Yeah. Now, at this time, Capel probably understood that the Dead were probably not going to be sending their master recordings to him. So he suggested another method, which would involve Dead Relics making a count of the orders and then letting the Dead reproduce the number of tapes ordered by the club. Ultimately, the Dead chose not to work with Capel, and he quickly, repurposed his idea from a record company to a fanzine. Now, there are many reasons that the band probably elected not to work with Capel, but the most obvious one was that they didn't really need him. Everything that Capel was proposing in Dead Relics, the Dead could do themselves at that point. They had started their own record company in 1973. They had the abilities to produce, distribute, and promote their own recordings, whether that be ones that would appear in stores or those that they could just market as part of their fan club. Now, one of the things, along with the publishing division, a booking agency, a touring group, when the band set up their own record company, they established 2 labels. Grateful Dead Records was reserved for releases by the band, and Round Records was reserved for solo releases and side projects. But in early 1976, members of the Dead organization began to kick around the idea of creating a 3rd label. Tentatively called Ground Records, this new label would be reserved for releasing archival albums, archival recordings. And on the document that you can see here at the bottom of the page, you can see some preliminary costs, some estimates for setting up the new label. But at the top of the page, some possible archive albums. Points 1 and 2 refer to outtakes from 2 solo albums by Jerry Garcia. RX 102 and RX 107 are the catalog numbers for Compliments and Reflections. Point 3, jams or outtakes from GD 103, which was Blues for Allah. But you can see points 8 and 9, practice recordings of the Dead and live recordings. Now, they were also considering compilations of different archival releases built around themes or topics. This was one called Railroad Blues, featuring tunes about trains. Big Railroad Blues, a very specific performance, an acoustic one from the Fillmore in September of 70. And tracks 6 through 8, more Grateful Dead live stuff. I Know You Rider, Railroad Blues, and Casey Jones. Now,
it has nothing to do with trains. I just had to put that in there. Go on.
Okay, yeah. Well, somebody thought it had something to do with trains. But at the time the Dead were considering Ground Records, the record company was in serious financial trouble. And by the end of the summer, the record company had dissolved. In October, though, they signed another major label contract, this time with Clive Davis and Arista Records. Now, in his memoir that he co-wrote with Anthony DeCurtis, Clive Davis noted that when he signed the Dead, he was really intent on them returning to the road. They'd been on a touring hiatus since the end of 1974, and he also wanted them to start producing studio records. He was not particularly interested in any of the side projects that they had been working on as part of the Grateful Dead record company, including plans for Ground Records. He was so serious about this that the label actually included a clause in the contract that the Dead signed that prohibited the band from releasing recordings of performances, of live performances that they had recorded themselves. So any plans that they had at the time to kind of release and distribute their own archival recordings was put on hold when they signed to Arista.
That's fascinating, given that what happened next. Well, 30 years after the death of Jerry Garcia, the Grateful Dead continued to attract new fans, both through live performances by Dead and Company et al., but also especially through these live recordings. For over 2 decades, these live recordings hosted on the Live Music Archive have been an invaluable resource for fans, historians, and anyone curious about the live legacy of the Dead. At the same time, the Dead continued to produce these releases from their vault. How did we get from that prohibition in that contract to Dick's Picks, Dave's Picks, and View from the Vault? And the Grateful Dead turned around and exploited that vault ridiculously well.
It took a while, but they really kind of persevered, and it was something that really beginning in 76, it was something that was very important to them. They understood the importance and significance of live recordings among their fans. And yes, I said, when they re-signed with Arista, returned to the road, returned in July of 76. And for all intents and purposes, with some breaks, we're on the road for the next 19 years. In addition to touring, they did exactly what Davis had wanted them to do, which was start recording some studio albums as well. Terrapin Station, Shakedown Street, and then Go to Heaven in 1980. They were also producing live records, 2 double live records from that were released on Arista in 1981. Both of them compilations that were recorded at the Warfield in San Francisco and Radio City Music Hall in New York City in September and October of 1980. Reckoning included acoustic performances from those shows, and Dead Set included songs from the band's electric sets. What you see here, again, another document from the archive. This is from a meeting that took place as the band were considering possible album titles for their latest record, for what would become Reckoning. And they say, hey, everybody, please note, this new album cannot be another Grateful Dead live LP. The title has been used too many times and will cause a lot of print confusion. We definitely need a name for this record.
Who wrote that?
I don't know. At the bottom, it says Rock Out. I'm wondering if maybe it was Rock Scully was at the meeting.
I don't recognize the handwriting.
I didn't either. Yeah, from the other kind of documents that I've seen. But you can see some of the titles they were kicking around there. Dead Reckoning, Dead Alive, Dead Heat.
Dead Weight.
Resurrection, number 4 there at the bottom of the page. This is great. They said it would be a good follow-up to Go to Heaven. It would also be a good title for a live recording as well. However, some people felt it had heavy religious connotations. So that one, put on the back burner. Eventually, they went with Reckoning. Already had the most votes. Garcia, though, said it lacked warmth. What's also interesting about this document, too, is this little note that appears on the side there, which says that also that Dan Healy and Jerry Garcia, producers for this record, say that the crowd ambiance, the crowd noise will be heard for a change, and we should keep the audience and band relationship in mind when titling. Now, this is interesting because when they recorded this record, they went out of their way to record the audience very meticulously and then mixed in the audience in a way that created this very intimate sound on the recordings. And it was designed to kind of emulate the smaller performance spaces of the Warfield and Radio City Music Hall. And so really here in 1981, we're still seeing how they are very conscious about how their records sound and creating this particular atmosphere. Because at this time, still, they could not release their own recordings independent of Arista. But things were starting to change by about 1982. Arista was about to be sold. The parent company, Bertelsmann, was about to sell them to RCA. And members of the Dead started to think a little bit about life after Arista, a new record contract. And so they started kicking around ideas. And in August of 1982, Alan Trist, the manager of the Dead's publishing company, Ice Nine, submitted a memo to Bill Kreutzmann and Phil Lesh regarding concert tape marketing. Basically, he was resurrecting the idea of ground records again in 1982. Noting, as you can see in point 1, concert tapes, he said, could be sold by direct mail through the Deadheads list. The Deadhead had a massive fan club, and they had access, they could promote their own merchandise and recordings direct through their fan club. That it was an entirely separate kind of promotional opportunity distinct from their major label. Point 3, he suggests some special selections that could be offered, drum breaks, an interesting project there called Bugs of Dada, selections by Phil.
The performance was a Mickey Hart and Barry Melton thing.
Thank you. I have no idea what that is.
I've heard little bits of it. It's quite bizarre.
Okay, well, I want to hear more of it. At point 5, though, he mentions that economically selling GD recorded music this way could entirely supplant record company albums and potentially make more money. And to this point, Trist also came up with a preliminary estimate estimating about 40,000 orders a year that would be provided through the Deadhead mailing list that could potentially net the band $200,000. Around the same time, the band were having meetings discussing what do we want from a record contract. Point 1 on the sheet was an emphasis on rates rather than advances. Point 6 at the bottom, very important still, a provision for the Dead to distribute their own recordings, direct recordings as part of their collector's series. Now, ultimately, Arista was sold to RCA. Clive Davis kept his job, and the Dead remained on the label, and so really life went on as normal, which at that time meant back onto the road. And by this time, the practice of taping had just grown and grown and grown. By the time that by the mid-'80s, it had become a bit unruly. And in 1984, the Dead implemented the tapers section. It was introduced at a run of concerts at the Berkeley Community Theater in October and November of '84. And this was a section reserved for the tapers behind the soundboard. On the right, you can see the Dead's longtime live sound mixer, Dan Healy, in front of many of the recordists, in a photo that was taken by my esteemed moderator, David Gans, who also figures very prominently in the story of live recordings, because it was the Deadhead Hour in its premiere in 1984, later syndicated in 1987, along with the recordings that were being traded among Deadheads of shows. The Deadhead Hour was now also being recorded as well and traded among fans, because if I'm correct, David, you had access to recordings that other people didn't have, and you were able to play recordings that people had never heard before. So I'm just wondering, were you kind of aware of kind of the go-between role that you were playing a little bit between Deadheads and the band?
Sure. I had by then I'd been a journalist. I'd had a relationship with the band that started in the late '70s when I was writing for BAM magazine. So I was friendly and hanging out with Phil and Bobby a little bit, and was in the office a lot and stuff. So when my first book was published, Playing in the Band, I appeared on the K-Fog Deadhead Hour, which had started 3 months earlier, to promote my book, and I did a little documentary about the song Greatest Story Ever Told and stuff. And eventually, the station asked me to take over responsibility for the program because the host of the show was incredibly overworked. He was the morning drive jock and everything else. And because I was friendly with band members and the management and stuff, Phil in particular said, you don't have to ask for permission. We trust your judgment. And they basically said, you can go in the vault and pull out tapes. And in those days, this was before Dick LaBalla was hired to manage the vault. Willie Legate, who was basically the caretaker at Club Front, just opened the vault door and went on his way. So I just went in there and started collecting tapes. And yeah, I was very well aware of what I was doing was important to the people out there. And to this day, I just got back from Las Vegas. I keep running into people who say, your radio show was how I became a Deadhead. Mission accomplished, people.
Yeah, I was just in Nashville, and I was speaking with a shop owner there, and she said the same thing, that she had access to, dozens, not hundreds of recordings of the Deadhead Hour. Yeah, so thank you, along with all the tapers. Thank you so much for...
A pleasure and a privilege.
You had mentioned Dick LaBalla, and with Willie Legate, who was the band's original archivist, and who was also the guy who came up with the phrase, "There's nothing like a Grateful Dead concert." Yeah, in '85, LaBalla was hired by the Dead to help archive and catalog recordings in this area that was now being referred to as the Vault, in their offices in San Rafael. But really, the big moment, the transformational moment for the Dead came in the summer of 1987. It was the release of In the Dark and the single Touch of Grey. The album went platinum. The single, accompanied by an incredibly popular music video that was in heavy rotation on MTV, sold out stadium shows, headlined by the Dead and also co-headlining with the Dylan. It really was kind of a summer of the Dead. And the important thing about this record is not only the success it brought, but this was the last record that the Dead owed to Arista. And so having just delivered kind of this massive success, they really held all the cards when it came time to renegotiate their contract. And when they did that in September of 1988, they received a number of favorable royalty rates, along with a generous advance. But most importantly, they also were granted the right to produce and distribute archival recordings independent of their record label. Finally, since '76, this was the moment where Arista was like, okay, you've proven it. Now you can go ahead and do it.
So the distinction was that as long as there wasn't any post-production, they could put it out.
Yeah, well, it's funny because if you read that, it also says that wasn't made using multi-track recorders or any mobile recording devices, which is interesting because the first archival release that came out was a multi-track recording that had been recorded on a mobile device. Wally Heider had recorded the recording that's on One from the Vault. This was their inaugural archival release, a complete show from August 13th of 1975. The band is still touring at this point, but 91, they're starting to release these archival recordings. 93 is when Dick's Pick series begins, named after Dick Latvala. But again, band is still touring at this time. But obviously, with the death of Jerry Garcia in 1995, that effectively put an end to the Dead as a touring group. And as people around the world began to kind of mourn and celebrate his life, people gathered in Golden Gate Park for a public memorial on August 13th of 95 to pay their respects, including members of the band. But unfortunately, the next day they had to get together to meet to decide what was the future of the band. It was a band that, at this point had a overhead of about $600,000 a month. And now with Garcia being gone, no longer a touring band, $20 million of performance income was gone. They predicted an immediate cash flow crisis. Employee layoffs seemed unavoidable. Everybody at Grateful Dead ticket sales, Grateful Dead publishing, Grateful Dead merchandising. But they also noted certain kind of continuing sources of income, record royalties, publishing, licensing, merchandising. But everybody agreed that it was going to be live recordings that were stored in the vault that were going to be a major asset to generate income in the future. And that's really how we get to Dave's Picks and to this, this long line of live recordings, post-Garcia. The Dead and Arista continued to work after the death of Garcia. Arista had been bought back by BMG, and one of the first archival releases after Garcia's death was 100 Year Hall. And this was different because this recording would have been available in record stores and in the US and throughout the world. The band already knew that they could sell records through their Deadhead mailing list. In 1995, the first volume of Dick's Picks had already sold 45,000 copies. They were probably very pleased then when 100 Year Hall was certified gold. I mean, this really suggested, yes, there was a much larger market for the Dead's archival releases. And the Dead and Arista worked together through into the 21st century. But really, so much of the 21st century has been the relationship between Grateful Dead and Rhino Records, beginning with The Golden Road in 2001, the box set of their earliest releases on Warner Brothers. In 2006, Rhino and the Dead signed an exclusive licensing deal that gave Rhino full responsible for the full range of Grateful Dead assets, including the vast archive of unreleased concert recordings. Some of the recordings that we've seen during that time, some of these box sets, Fillmore West from 1969, the Mega Box set from 2011, 73 discs, documenting all the shows of the band's Europe tour in 1972. Meanwhile, though, as the Dead and Rhino continue to release archival recordings, the Dead are also releasing records through Grateful Dead Productions, their own company. The Road Trip series, 17 releases from 2007 to 2011. And Dave's Picks, beginning in 2012, I think we're up to 54 volumes right now. 2017, the Dead and Rhino extend their agreement to 2039. And in the special issue of Billboard devoted to the Dead, current archivist and legacy manager Dave Lemieux kind of outlines the projected plan of how the band is going to be releasing live recordings for the foreseeable future, including Dave's Picks, special box sets, and one other large project. And we continue to see those get shown the light 4 shows, consecutive shows from May of 1977, including the Dead's fabled show at Barton Hall. And I think coming out in a couple of weeks, Enjoying the Ride, commemorating the band's 60th anniversary release. So yeah, this is how we get from ground records to what we see today. And the band still remains one of the most popular recording acts. Lots of commercial releases, to be sure. But for anybody who's interested, I would encourage you to start your listening experience at the Live Music Archive, dip your toe in, and see where it leads you.
It is a ridiculously huge resource. We are so lucky. Thank you, John. This has been wonderful.
Well, John, David, thank you so much for the conversation today. Please, everyone, do be sure to pick up your copy of Live Dead. Grab it today from Duke University Press. It's a really enjoyable read. Stay up to date on everything that's happening at and around the Internet Archive through our blog and our events calendar. Thanks all. Have a great day. Thanks for joining us on this journey into the future of knowledge. Be sure to follow the show. New episodes drop every other Wednesday with bold ideas, fresh insights, and the voices shaping tomorrow.